All right, good morning, and thank you for being here for our Morning Byte of Cyber webinar series. We're going to get started here this morning. Today, we'll cover the CMMC as the first part of a series here with Dr. Steve Beatty. Dr. Steve Beatty is the professor and the chair of the Computer Sciences Department at MSU Denver, where he helped with the creation of a bachelor's and master's of cybersecurity. The bachelor's degree has NSA Center of Academic Excellence certification. Steve has a long background in cybersecurity, including the cybersecurity team at the National Center for Atmospheric Research for 5 years. He's a provisional assessor and instructor for the CMMC as well. Before we pass it off to Steve, we do have a few Zoom reminders. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get those answered once they come in. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sending the link to the recording back out to everyone following the presentation. You can also view our previous Morning Byte of Cyber webinars on the National Cybersecurity Center YouTube page as well. And with that, I will pass it off to our guest today. Steve, take it away.
Thanks very much. Let me share a PowerPoint. Just gonna sort of use the PowerPoint as discussion, but it's certainly not gonna do, hopefully, a kind of death by PowerPoint. So CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And so today's webinar, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the background, where we're coming from, and a brief introduction. We have a couple of more times to talk about the CMMC, so we'll go into more depth at that point. Look, I know this is alphabet soup. Not only is it cybersecurity, it is the DoD cybersecurity. And so that tends to make it very acronym heavy. And so I'll do my very best to define the acronyms as I go along, but I'm pretty good at spewing them out. So if at any point I'm saying something that is just completely Greek, please do let me know. And I'll go back and try to define terms and those sorts of things. So if we look at, what are we talking about here, right? We're talking about cybersecurity, and we're talking about the Department of Defense. So I went out and looked at the world's largest companies from a revenue. Berkshire Hathaway, 276 billion. Toyota, ExxonMobil, the usual suspects here. United Health, CVS Health, interestingly enough, from a revenue point of view, pretty big. Volkswagen, Apple, one of the best capitalized companies on the planet, of course, at the moment. Saudi Aramco, who is the major oil and gas supplier in Saudi Arabia. They, of course, have had two major ransomware issues, or malware issues, I guess would be more appropriate, where they had tens of thousands of computers, what we call bricked, and made useless by an adversary. Amazon, well up there in revenue, of course, and Walmart, again, way up there. But if we look at the budget, if you will, the DoD has on paper about $772 billion of appropriations. We also know that it's probably quite a bit more than that. Chances are more than double that, because of the monies that aren't essentially directly reported. And so this is the stuff that's reported. So the DoD, as it turns out, is a major company. And I know I'm stretching the terms here a little bit, but they certainly have a very large budget, and they certainly are able to throw that budget around pretty well to the number of companies that are out there that contract with them. So what the DoD cares about, they do not care about personally identifiable information. They don't care about your HIPAA data. They care about the data that you create for them and that they provide to you. So one of those things is what we call Federal Contract Information, FCI. And so if you have a federal contract, you have this. And you must, and then I'll talk about the regulation around this, you must not, in general, release these data. And so everybody essentially who has FCI has regulations around cybersecurity that they must abide by. Next step up then is what we call Controlled Unclassified Information, CUI. So this doesn't get into secret, top secret, those sorts of classifications, but this is information, these are data that the DoD wants you to safeguard. And so many DoD contracts have this. We often see this as something called Controlled Technical Information, CTI. There is a CUI registry out there. Actually, it's maintained by the National Archives and Records Administration. And so NARA keeps track of the different aspects of CUI. They have an organization internally called ISU that does those sorts of things. CUI, then sometimes pronounced CUI, depending on who you're talking with, it must be safeguarded, and it must be safeguarded with some fairly serious, both technical and then physical, personal sorts of controls. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. The next time we get together, I'll be doing a much deeper dive into how these things must be safeguarded. So how big a problem is this? It's an interesting question in general. So the current count, if you look on the GSY website, is that there's more than 100,000 defense industrial base companies and their subcontractors. So there's a lot of companies out there, a lot of small companies. There's sort of the big five as we know them as you can name them, you know, the Raytheons, the Lockheeds, the L3s, these sorts of things. But they have been a bunch of subcontractors. And so it's a very large problem in general. So a bunch of companies, a bunch of people working for those companies. So there's also been, as we probably know, a lot of exfiltration, that is the stealing of data from defense industrial base companies, from defense contractors. And so lots of incidences in general, but there's also then been a whole lot of exfiltration. So I was curious about this and I went out and looked. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies publishes a paper, or has published a paper called Significant Cyber Incidents. This runs to 74 pages, and so a bunch. And many of us are aware of, for a number of different reasons, right? The Target hack, the Home Depot hack, the Office of Personnel Management hack. So the exfiltration there was of some very sensitive data, right? Special Form 86s that a number of us have filled out in order to get clearances. And the Equifax hack, which is actually related to the Office of Personnel Management hack, got a whole lot of financial data. And so it turns out the same country did both of those hacks, and now they can put together people who maybe have some financial concerns and clearances, which of course is not a good mix of things. Regardless, then, the Center for Strategic and International Studies published a whole bunch of general cybersecurity incidents. I just pulled out the ones that mentioned US defense contractors. And so there are a bunch listed in here. I'm not going to go through them. So you're more than welcome, of course, to look at the presentation and the original report itself. The URL for the original report is in the notes for this presentation. So if you want to follow up on that. Regardless, we see Russia, we see China, we see a number of other different bad actors, as sometimes they're called, looking at, for various good reasons, of course, at the US defense contractors. And so the US Department of Defense has become very concerned, I think correctly, of being the research and development arm for many of the countries around the world. And so this list essentially goes on and on and on. And so again, not going to read through all of these and all the different places that at least attempts have been made, going all the way back. And I skipped a bunch, I lighted a bunch here. One of the major, I think, wake-up calls was in 2007, where a defense subcontractor had most of the plans, if not all of the plans for the F35, and those were exfiltrated into China. And so again, the DoD, for very good reasons and for the health and well-being of the United States, has become very concerned about what's going on and how then it can support the increasing needs of people in cybersecurity in the defense industrial base. So let's then get a little geeky on regulations. There's something known as the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Inside of the FAR, of course, we have been a bunch of different sections, but section 52.204-21 is entitled The Basic Safeguarding of Covered Contractor Information Systems. And so, no, this is basic. This is if you have federal contract information. And so if you have FCI, you have to abide by the FAR 52-204-21 regulation. And importantly here, and we will talk about this more in coming episodes, if you will, it's covered contractor information systems. One, this isn't a regulation for the federal government itself. There is something known as FISMA, and FISMA is the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or the Federal Information Systems Modernization Act. The name has changed through the years, it turns out. And so that's not this. This is for contractors. And it's also important here, and we'll talk about this, that the scope is those things that are handling FCI. So you may have a number of different systems in your corporation that don't handle federal contract information. So could be, for example, your human resources department doesn't need to have any FCI. And so then those we don't have to worry about. We don't have to worry about those systems. We only have to worry about those systems that are essentially in scope. Inside of this FAR clause, then, there are about 15 cybersecurity controls. And so, which doesn't sound like a big deal, and it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. However, when you are doing a self-assessment, which you are allowed to do with this, it's called CMMC level 1, there are about 60 assessment objectives. And so inside of those 15, there are multiple objectives that you need to meet. And you need to do a self-assessment saying that you essentially meet all 60 of those. Inside of those 60, each one you can either we call it EIT, which is you can provide evidence that you're doing that. You can say, well, here's the anti-malware software that I'm running. Or you can do what we call an interview, which is, all right, I talked to the person who's in charge of IT or in charge of cybersecurity, and this was the answer that they had. Or you can test it. And so tests often would be, well, we have this policy that after 3 bad attempts at a password, that you are locked out of your system. So we can walk up to a system, try to log in, and if after 3 attempts we are locked out, then with that test essentially, I guess, is passed. And so in general, then the FAR clauses address these following areas. Authentication, auth-n, which is how do we prove who we are? And so how we prove who we are, the big 3 are something you know, something you have, and something you are. So that is something you know is password, something you have is typically, for example, an RSA fob, a CAC, a common access card, or a cell phone. So those are something you have. Then something you are biometrics, right? We've gone a long way, happily, along the biometrics path here. And so facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, these sorts of things are biometrics. So once you have proven who you are, then we talk about authorization. Now the system, let's say, knows who you are. What are you allowed to do? And so are you allowed to install software? Are you allowed to change the security configuration? Those sorts of things. So we break these 2 things, although they sound a lot alike, they are called out, they are different. So we call them auth-n for authentication and auth-z for authorization. Proving who you are, and then once you've proved who you are, what do you get to do? Another thing that you have to assure is physical access. That is, those systems that contain FCI, federal contract information, need to be protected physically. So behind, in general, we say one locked barrier of some variety or another. We also need to show that we have media destruction policies. That is, once we're done with the contract, we have to show that we then destroy the FCI that we have access to. You also have to have a firewall of some variety or another. So connections to outside systems. And in general, this also means some amount of what we call network segmentation. That is, in the previous example, if the HR department doesn't need to see FCI, how do we keep those 2 networks separate? So that's then another thing we have to worry about. Anti-malware, of course, we need to have active anti-malware on all of the systems. We have to scan those systems kind of on an ongoing basis. Now, the periodicity of that, et cetera, is a little up for grabs, but most people would say at least once a year. And so we have to then make sure that our systems on an ongoing basis are up to snuff. And so those are the major issues that we have to deal with when we have federal contract information, and we're then regulated by the FAR 52. Next step up then is the DFAR, so the Defense Acquisitions Regulations Supplement. And this is what we call 252.204-7012. There are a number of different specifications in the 252.204. The major one to date is the 7012. With the rollout of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, there are 3 more, and we'll dive more deeply into them a little later on in another one of our webinars. This is called then Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Incident Reporting. So it's beyond then just the simple guarding of FCI. Here, the DFARS then drops in the CUI, and there's a lot more to it. It also then adds, when you have had a cyber incident, you must report that cyber incident. And so there is a place to, essentially, there's a website, email address, etc. That when you've had an incident, you know you've had an incident, you must report it within 72 hours to the DoD. This 7012 is based upon, here comes some more alphabet soup, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, Special Publication, SP, 800-171. There are a bunch of NIST publications in what we call the 800 series. They all deal with cybersecurity. One of them is the 171. So that's what's used for contractors, for federal contractors, is the 171. Internally, I mentioned before, FISMA is based on 853. And again, there are essentially hundreds of these standards that NIST publishes and that the federal government follows and requires their contractors to follow. 171 is entitled Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information. There's the CUI right in the title, in non-federal information systems and organizations. So that's the thrust of 171. And so 171 came into effect a number of years ago. The first call out essentially that you had to abide by this was in 2017. By November, the end of November 2017, Defense Industrial Base contractors had to have submitted a 171 assessment to what we call SPRS, or sometimes called SPRS. That remains in effect. And so all contractors still have to abide by this regulation. So inside of 171, there are 110. So we've moved from 15 or 17 controls to 110, which is a big step up. There's no question about that. There are substantially stronger rules inside of 171 than there is just in the simple FARS clause. And that sounds like a lot, but there's also about 300 assessment objectives. So we're moving from 60 to about 300 assessment objectives when we're talking about each of these different controls. So clearly some of these controls have multiple assessment objectives that need to be assessed either internally or by an external organization. So that leads us, if you will, to the CMMC. So the 171 is in place, in practice. You still have to upload your 171 self-assessment into SPRS on contract actions. That is the award of a new contract or the continuation of an existing contract. And so that has to continue to be the case. The CMMC is relatively new. And so it is the Cyber Maturity Model Certification. And the Office of the Under Secretary of Defense, the acquisition and sustainment, is essentially in charge of the CMMC. And here is, the canonical site for the CMMC. It's a .mil site, of course, and so that's where the model itself is. And there are a lot of supporting documentation, there at the CMMC website. In addition to what the military is doing, there is also essentially a nonprofit 503c, I think it is, organization that is helping with what's called the CMMC ecosystem. And so that is called these days cyberab.org. And so that's the cyber accreditation body. They recently changed their names, of course, because we have to change names from time to time. So the Cyber AB then is the folks that are training the people who will go out and do the assessment, such as me, and the people who are training the Cyber AB, train the instructors, train the registered practitioners, these sorts of things. So the DoD has essentially handed off responsibility for the CMMC ecosystem to the Cyber AB. The Cyber AB also accredits the folks who do the training materials and who do the training organizations and so forth. So I'll talk a little bit more about that probably next time or the time after that as to what the Cyber AB looks like. But it's interesting that this is a model that's been used in industry a lot, where we have these independent organizations, ISO, for example, that is in charge of accrediting certain cybersecurity sorts of things. Another is, of course, the credit card folks, the PCI folks, use third-party organizations for the assessment, the accreditation of cybersecurity. The Department of Defense has adopted that model, and the CMMC is being essentially administered from an end user point of view by the Cyber AB. So the CMMC in general has more requirements than NIST 800-171. So 171, for example, does not require a system security plan per se. It mentions system security plans, but they're essentially not required. Business continuity is not required by the 800-171, where it is for the CMMC. And so the CMMC adds a number of different requirements to 800-171. And so United States worked with what we call the 5 Eyes community, which is the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, to come up with these CMMC additions. There's been more and there's been fewer as time has gone by. And so we're back down to, if you will, the fewer number. However, it's more than the 171. It's also true then that the CMMC allows self-assessment for level 1, and level 1 is the 15 practices, controls for the FAR clause. So you can still have self-assessment at level 1. At level 2, though, while everybody used to be able to self-assess around 171, that's no longer going to be the case. And so while we don't know firm numbers, a number that's been bandied about essentially is that 80% of the defense contractors will have to have an external entity assess their cybersecurity. And the organizations that will be doing that are called, and here comes another acronym, C3PAOs, okay, which is a certified third-party assessor organization. And so these 3 PAOs will come into your organization, review your documentation and practices, interview people, typically be on site because they also have to have some level of assessment of your physical controls. And so in addition to that, in general, you get to pay for that pleasure. And so you will be paying a C3PAO to do your level 2 assessments. And it is those C3PAOs, those certified third-party assessor organizations, who will be entering the results of your assessment into SPRS, something that's going to be called EMAS moving forward. So it's no longer just simple self-assessments, if you will. It's also the case historically that many organizations, even if they filled out a 171 self-assessment, they were allowed to put in what's called a plan of action and milestone. That is, yeah, we know we don't do this. We know we don't have 2-factor authentication everywhere, but we're going to work on it. And so the plan of action and milestones in general are called POAMs. those are not going to be allowed moving forward. And so you have a certain amount of leeway to have a POAM in place at the time of assessment, that they essentially have to disappear within 90 days. And so it's substantially stricter than it has been in the past. And the third-party assessments, of course, are a whole new wrinkle into this. It's also the case that there are more penalties that are going to be associated with the CMMC than have been in the past, simply because, right, I think a lot of organizations saw it as a box that they had to check instead of something that was helping out the defense of the United States. And so there is a carrot. The carrot is that you might have preferential treatment and contract actions if you have filed your CMMC 171, had a C3PAO come in and do your assessment. The stick is what's called the False Claims Act. And so this has long been, the False Claims Act has been in place for a long, long time. The DoD has recently started using it for cybersecurity incidents. And so Cisco Systems essentially were fined $8 million recently in a False Claim Act. And so this is an interesting act too, in that it pays the whistleblower. And so if you say that my company isn't up to speed in cybersecurity, then it can be you can win money, actually, strangely, from that. So the person who was the whistleblower inside of Cisco got 1 million of that $8 million because of the False Claims Act. So that's a huge and very high level overview of the CMMC. Now I'm going to stop sharing. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And I think I made it in my 20 minutes. It's a good thing I had all that espresso.
I think so. Yeah, so Steve, I had one question that you might have already covered or mentioned in there. But in terms of, let's say that I'm a new contractor or subcontractor, and I go through the assessment process during my initial, I go through it once. How often do I have to do that assessment again?
Great question. So level 1, you have to do assessment every single year, and that's a self-assessment. Level 2, if you have an external assessor, it's once every 3 years. If you are allowed by the Department of Defense to do self-assessments, it depends upon the sensitivity of what you're working on, then you have to do the same thing. It's a self-assessment every single year. So it just depends on whether you have the external one at level 2, which is then every 3 years, or if you're allowed to do an internal one, it's then every year.
Okay, got it. And then I had one more question. Bringing in a C3 PAO.
Yep.
That I imagine that those are, longer engagements that cost a significant amount.
Yep.
What is that number?
Numbers are hard to come by, but general rule of thumb is it will take a week of 4 assessors, and so you'll have some pre-work with what's called the lead assessor, but then the actual assessment usually takes a week, 4 or 5 days, and the usual rule of thumb is it takes 3 or 4 assessors to do a thorough job. So yes, you will be paying for their time for that week. And then, of course, a little bit of time before and after as they write things up. So I can't put an exact number on because I'm not a C3PAO, but I think you can easily plan on tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's all the questions that I had after listening to all that, just out of curiosity. I don't think we have any questions here in the chat.
Great.
So we can finish up for today, but thank you for your time, and thank you for presenting to everyone here. We're going to have this recording sent out to everybody that that registered for the webinar today, and we look forward to, like you said, the next CMMC episode with Dr. Steve Beatty.
Yeah, thanks so much. Have a great day.